So let's talk through all the remaining Warhammer 40k factions that are yet to receive a Codex in 10th edition, what miniatures faction collectors might want, and which minis they're most likely to receive. Hello and welcome back to Warspecs Tactics, where today we're talking miniature rollouts in Warhammer 40k 10th, and with the dawn of 2025, Games Workshop's going to be getting the Codex releases rolling once again. There's still really quite a lot of books to come out, so for this video I thought we could talk through the miniature releases that are most likely to turn up when they do. Currently in 10th edition we've had around about half the Codexes out so far, Games Workshop maybe having gone a little bit slower over the past few months, and the ones still to come are Astra Militarum, Aeldari, Imperial and Chaos Knights, Space Wolves and Black Templars, Grey Knights, Death Guard Thousand Sons, World Eaters and Emperor's Children, Drukhari and Leagues of Votann, and Chaos Demons if they do indeed get a 10th edition Codex and aren't reinterpreters. That's barring any other surprises of course, like a sudden arrival of Dark Mechanicum or something. Though I feel like given that we're getting Emperor's Children, I'd be a bit surprised if we got another new faction quite so soon. If Games Workshop are sticking to their very successful 3-year release cycle model, which I strongly suspect that they will, that means that we've only got around about 18 months of the edition left, and the vast majority of these books will likely be within the next 12 months. If they did the exact same as 9th edition, then we'd only expect 2 out of that list to be coming in 2026. And in 10th edition they generally seem to have a pretty set way of how they release things. When a new faction gets an updated codex, they get a new combat patrol, probably besides Imperial Knights, and a lot of them haven't been better than the 9th edition ones. They usually get a one and done Battle Force box set with a character miniature to sell it a bit more. And usually at least one miniature release. Typically it's either a major release wave where they get a whole bunch of different kits, or otherwise it's usually just 1 or maybe 2 character miniatures. They're the ones that Games Workshop seems to go for filler for 40k, just so every time a book comes out they do actually have a new miniature to go with them, and likely adding something new and interesting or filling an obvious gap in their range. Out of this list we know a whole bunch of confirmations, though I thought it could be interesting to talk through each faction in turn, talk about what we know and any other hints that Games Workshop might have said that might be coming, and perhaps any other more obvious gaps in the faction ranges that could be good choices for Games Workshop to expand into in the future. Jumping straight into them, and perhaps the one that we know the most about the release is the Astra Militarum, confirmed to be the first Codex of 2025, and it could be any weekend from now they decide to release the Death Corps army set, which will be the first thing that they do for them. To round up the releases, first up we have the army set, which will come with a wave of the new models plus the codex and data cards. And in that release we've got the new Death Riders with their famous clawed steeds, plus the choice of either sabres or lancers. The artillery team that can make one of a big number of indirect fire pieces. The combat engineer team with their shotguns, trench clubs and remote control mine. Lord Marshal Dreer, a new frontline commander special character miniature for the Death Corps. And then looking beyond the big box set, we've got the Death Corps of Krieg Command Squad led by the Commissar, and then the new Death Corps of Krieg Heavy Weapons Squad with the different variant weapons with heavy stobbers, plus the option for some fairly scary looking heavy flamers, plus a fire team coordinator there, which I believe they hinted was allowing them to fire on death. As well as that, they also confirmed the new combat patrol for Astra Militarum. That one's 10 Rough Riders, 10 Kazakin and Acadian Command Squad, and didn't really go down very well as just a bit of an odd cluster of models, though I'm sure it'd be useful to at least some people. Finally, the Guard did rather well with recent Kill Team releases as well. We've had both the Ratlings and the Tempestus Aquilons as well. The Ratling's still waiting for a solo release. I guess there's a reasonable chance that could come with the next Kill Team box set. My guess is that we've already seen everything for the Astra Militarum, though just given how big and broad scope the faction is, they've kind of got endless options they could continue releasing beyond that if they really wanted to. Lots of scope for new and different units, but also loads of things that they've had access to in the past in various different forms, particularly including Forge World. Maybe the single most obvious one might be an update and range refresh for the Kaschan Jungle Fighters. They're basically well deserving of a range refresh similar to the Cadians in Krieg. We had Cadians in 9th edition and Krieg in 10th. It would be really quite cool to see a Kaschan release for 11th edition, redoing their core kits, plus maybe a re-release of Sergeant Harker and Ironhand Strachan, though I'm not too sure what the likelihood of that is, after Guard have just basically had 2 major releases, one edition after another. Otherwise I feel like Commissar Yarrick coming back would have a lot of people interested. They did keep the details of his death rather mysterious. It would be pretty awesome to have him show up again to fight some orcs. But otherwise, beyond a few of the more obvious Codex things, they could do kits for the Lost Regiments done Kill Team style, perhaps Fosterans, Mordians, Steel Legion or Talon or others. A biker unit seems like it could be a really obvious choice for the Guard, kind of odd that they don't have them when quite so many factions do. They could do fast attack vehicles such as maybe borrow a Taurus Venator from Necromunda, given that they released that kit there. Perhaps do something like a plastic Imperial fighter jet with a Thunderbolt or Lightning, though I feel like Games Workshop don't seem to be super keen to push more planes into the game these days. And beyond that, just a huge amount of Forge World kits that went away and could be resurrected, all manner of different variants of tanks and things, maybe Hades breaching drills, Cyclops demolition vehicles or others. Guard did have one of the biggest Forge World categories before everything was gradually wound down. In any case though, most of this seems very unlikely to be happening in 10th edition, given that we've already had the Deathcore release wave unveiled, and so far we haven't really had any indication that there's any more kits coming than this. Before we move on to the other upcoming codexes of 10th edition, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. One option to get an entire battlefield worth of Warhammer 40k related terrain on the board very quickly, with their solution being very different to the vast majority of things out there, with a system of pop-up fold-out ruins, springing up from a bunch of cardboard tiles and all being able to be folded flat so they can basically be transported from house to house in a box set that's basically the same size as a regular board game. The biggest selling points for it are that it's far cheaper than Games Workshop, though most terrain is. It doesn't require any hobby work or effort. If that's a limited resource for you and you prefer to use it on the playing pieces themselves, and obviously the transport thing is probably the biggest thing. It does come with some trade-offs and downsides as well. A bit less sturdy and robust than some terrain sets out there, and doesn't really do tournament competitive layouts if that's what you're after. But in general I've heard a good amount of positive feedback about the terrain, and can be quite a good option for casual gaming that you can take up and put down as needed. I'll cycle back to talk about a few of their more specific offerings at the end of the video, but feel free to check them out, links down in the video description. And of course a big thank you to them for sponsoring this one. Next up, and after the Astra Militarum, we have the Aeldari. Again, we've had a huge wave of kits revealed for them. There's new Fugan and the Dire Avengers, new Swooping Hawks gracefully jumping off some fallen Aeldari structures, a rather spectacular new Balharoth miniature to lead them into battle, Asmund returning updated to lead the Dire Avengers into battle, 40k's oldest miniatures getting a new resculpt in the Warp Spiders. It was really quite nice to see them updated in style. And then perhaps the biggest and most interesting surprise was the new Warp Spider Phoenix Lord in Lycus, a pretty cool miniature bursting out of the warp with that sort of spiderweb effect on the teleport thing. Again, like the Guard, I'd guess that we've probably seen the vast majority of the Aeldari reveals, though it does maybe feel like there were a couple of models kind of conspicuous by their absence. Often in 10th edition it seems to have been a bit of a judgment day for resin miniatures, and in particular Karandras, Imperial Knights Spear and Prince Iriel of Iandin. All of those guys are out of the Games Workshop web store at the moment, so have a fairly high chance to get their rules sent to Legends unless they give them an updated model. I feel like Imperial Knights Spear is probably going to be the lowest out of these for priority for an update. Karandras seems kind of weird that we didn't see him, given that these Striking Scorpions got their cool new Kill Team update. It seems unlikely that they wouldn't have redone his miniature at the same time as they did the Striking Scorpions, but it looks like maybe he's being kept for a later date or something. And Prince Iriel I'm a bit unsure about. I guess he'd be quite a good standalone character release if they did say want something for a lower key Aeldari reboot in 11th. In any case, hopefully they don't just go away Commissar Yarrick style, as I feel like they're really quite big and well developed characters, maybe in a way that Illic isn't so much. Otherwise for Aeldari, I guess we've probably seen the majority of their reveals. It was kind of conspicuous that they didn't show us any sort of Battle Force box set though. The vast majority of armies in 10th edition have had one of those, so I guess it's not impossible that there might have been new miniatures that they haven't shown that could be coming in one of them. Maybe there might be some sort of split release where some of the new miniatures come out in a Battle Force box set, and then some of them wind up turning up with the Codex later. Otherwise they will get a new Combat Patrol, which I guess would probably be kind of bad news given that the current one is seen as at least fairly good. Maybe just one more unit in the box set than you might expect versus Games Workshop's modern ones, and particularly given that they seem to be removing all the big exciting models out that you can't really handle quite so well in a 500-point game, I strongly suspect there wouldn't be anything Wraithlord size in the next one. Otherwise for Aeldari possibilities, they generally feel like a faction where they most needed that bunch of their Aspect Warriors redoing, so that did seem like the best and most obvious choice. I guess beyond that they do have plenty of opportunity for other things though. They could resurrect some of their Forge World units like Shadow Spectres and Hornets, which I'd guess will be sent to Legends. Seems unlikely to happen this time. They still do have some pretty old plastics in the range, the Viper, Wave Serpents and Falcon kit for example. Plus the Dire Avenger kit isn't the best quality one, having some mould line issues. Otherwise they could dive more into one of the other Aeldari tropes. People have often wanted to see what they'd do if they did Exodites, and they could go down the route of more Corsairs given that they had a sort of semi-independent Forge World range for them, but I believe not all the models were released in the end. Another option if they wanted to keep a Ranger character could be to re-release Amelin Shadow Guide, the Ranger character from Blackstone Fortress. Feels like she could take up the role of Illic if they really wanted to, and they wouldn't have to make a new plastic sculpt, but in general they seem to have been doing that more for the Imperial factions as opposed to Xenos. It's not like the Tau got Deus Grec or anything. Next up, and supposedly the next Codex on Games Workshop's roadmap that they mentioned, were the Imperial Knights. It certainly looked like they'd be the next release after Aeldari by that very nebulous map, but at least it implies that they're early in the year. They were kind of notable as the only major Warhammer 40k faction not to get an actual release with their Codex in 9th edition. The Knight players in general did alright out of the Horus Heresy ranges, getting things like the redone Sevastus Knight Lancer, and then the Acheron Castigator ones after that. I'd hope as a result that Imperial Knights might get something for 10th edition, though to be honest, maybe one of the highest things on my wish list would be to just incorporate the Sevastus Knights into the core Knight Codex in a way that implies that they are going to be part of the core 40k range going onwards. It's not like the Imperial Knights have a crazy amount of kits, so those big Forge World Knights that have been redone in plastic are ones that really quite a lot of people have picked up. It'd just be good to have the security that they're not going to get pushed into legends like, say, the new plastic Leviathan and Contemptor Dreadnoughts did for the Space Marines. Games Workshop did say that Knights and Custodians would be treated a bit differently on that front, but I'd not really trust that guaranteed to last longer than 10th edition. Otherwise though, it feels like there's a fair few ways that Games Workshop could expand their range, maybe an expanded plastic Armiger kit kind of similar to the Chaos Wardog one. That one's got a dedicated melee variant, which it seems no real reason that the Imperial Knights couldn't have one of their own. I feel like they could easily gain a Gatling cannon variant if Games Workshop wanted to. It would be quite handy to have the smaller knights have something to deal with enemy infantry a bit better at least. Otherwise they could just go more creative and just do another knight pattern of some sort, another Titanic variant maybe. Perhaps some obvious tropes they could go down would be something like a Siege Knight with a whole bunch of armour and close range anti-tank sort of gear, or maybe a Psyker Knight in a sort of sanctic mirror to the Chaos Abominant. Maybe something like a jump armiger is something that I've heard people talk about a few times in the past, perhaps in a similar sort of way to some of the Heresy era battle automata. They could do men-at-arms, so the Imperial Knights don't just have to ally small units of Imperial agents and get them something a bit more themed. They do make mention of sort of feudal men-at-arms that they have on the Night Worlds to support them a little, and I feel like that could be really quite fun to see. Though I guess as Heresy things continue to roll out, there at least feels like there'd be a pretty reasonable chance they'd continue to do the other Knights in plastic. That's be the Atropos, Questa Megara and Styrex, and the Armiger Moirax. I'd guess that the Acastus ones might be a bit big for plastics, particularly given that the Sevastus Knights are already Games Workshop's biggest and most expensive plastic kit. Definitely feels there's possibilities though. Hopefully they get something this time around for 10th though. I feel like there's at least a pretty reasonable chance that Chaos Knights get redone at the same time, as it just kind of makes sense. Though it was interesting that they put the Imperial Knights specifically on their roadmap but not Chaos Knights. No idea whether that's trying to imply that they might be coming at separate times, but if I had to guess I would suspect it to be sometime around the Imperials. They got quite a good release in 9th edition, their expanded Abhorrent kits to make the Abominant, proper Wardog models that seems to pretty much define the army ever since, plus they can also make use of those redone Heresy era Knights. I guess for options for them, if there was another Knight chassis out there, then I guess they'd also be able to make use of it too. They'd also enjoy any other Heresy era Knights, and certainly could do some sort of cultists or vassals in a similar way to Imperial Knight men-at-arms. Feels like they very much could just use the standard Chaos cultists from Chaos Space Marines though. Much in the same way as they do for that new detachment, I feel like people wouldn't be against them actually being included in the Codex, so you don't have to buy an extra one if that's going to be a thing. Otherwise, I suppose you could do a Chaos Knight Tyrant, given that that is an option that you can field, but they don't actually have a Chaos-specific version of that, unlike the Abhorrent and the War Dogs. It does feel a bit unlikely to me though. Just seems like it'd be a rather big effort kit to make a new version of if it was just going to basically be this but with spikes. I'd guess they'd probably change the loadouts in some way if they did. Again, maybe a little bit less clear as to where they might go. Maybe could do something like a named character knight like Sir Hector if they wanted to expand the Abhorrent kit once again. Or maybe they could lean more into the whole chaos warping aspect of them. Perhaps have something looking truly demonic and possessed, or something with a great big dire armour of some sort on the top of one. I've certainly seen some cool conversions to that sort of effect. Next up, for the other army that we've heard the most about officially, we've got the Emperor's Children. Games Workshop have been building hype for the past 6 weeks or so before Christmas, giving us a bunch of teasers and confirming they'll be in 2025 sometime, and then showcasing Fulgrim's 40k model on Christmas Day, very likely being the same price as the other Demon Primarchs. Beyond that, we've seen a whole bunch of new design pieces, which are presumably for new Noise Marines, a bunch of heads, some shoulder pads, and then even an Emperor's Children on the cover of Codex Aeldari, maybe hinting at their colour scheme for when we see the miniatures in full. Otherwise, we also saw the new sonic weapons as well, complete with volume dials, air horn canisters, and sort of bagpipe valve things, all ready to bring the noise in earnest there. Definitely a whole load of hype for the release, people who were interested in the faction before, looking to jump on the noise train no doubt. It seems likely to be sometime mid-2025, we've already got Guard and Aeldari releases to come and they'll take up a few months I'm sure. though in general they don't tend to have the most enormous lead time between model reveals and codexes coming out. I feel like around about 6 months or so might be kind of lightly if we go by, say, the Leagues of Votann example. In any case, aside from Fulgrim, I'd be very surprised if they didn't have a launch box as well with the Codex in to start with, plus a clutch of new minis, and then eventually we'll also follow up with a Combat Patrol box set, which maybe could be kind of similar to the launch box if they go by the similar sort of thing that they did to the Imperial Guard one. The things that feel absolutely confirmed for them would be a new set of Noise Marines and new Lucius the Eternal. It's just kind of impossible to imagine them redoing Emperor's Children and not doing those. Beyond that though, they feel like a lot of things that feel like possibilities, but I don't think we'll get all of them. New Terminators are definitely a possibility, or maybe some other elites similar to 8-bound. Perhaps raised cultists of some sort, given that all the other deity legions have them. It feels like there'd at least have to be at least one generic lord or character, so there's something else to go alongside the named ones and take some enhancements and things. And perhaps other more out there possibilities could be Slaneshi demon engines, maybe a possessed alternative, or a unique Sonic Dreadnought or Hellbrute could all be possible. I feel like Games Workshop have tended to have a bit more of a preference for infantry kits as priority over vehicles recently though, so I'd much more strongly be expecting armoured elites and things as opposed to tanks or demon engines at my first guess. As well as the Emperor's Children though, we have the reimagined forms of the 3 other deity codexes too. Thousand Sons are the ones that we maybe had the most obvious lore teaser for, with a very specific and slightly over-enthusiastic lore segment out of some Pariah Nexus narrative, with the idea that Thousand Sons have dug up a whole bunch of their past automata that they used to use, then ensorcelled them and put demons in them, then loosed a bunch of AdMech technology to upgrade them further and stick Blackstone all over them, just in case you didn't think that they were weird, warped and psychic enough. Games Workshop don't generally tend to pour that much hype into something that isn't getting a model, so it feels like it'd be really quite odds on at some point, hopefully within 10th, and there's at least some suspicion that we might have seen the automata already, potentially with these bits from the rumour engines. The one on the bottom left looks like it might have an element of the sort of blue and yellow stripes on the front of the shin plate, and they all look painted up kind of similar, though I guess it's not impossible that it could be something Chaos Knights or something else. Hopefully they do get something though. It'd be quite nice just to gain a few more options for them, given that their army lists tend to be a bit on the samey side at the moment. Otherwise though, they're certainly a faction that haven't got all that much support since their big launch with Magnus and everything. Maybe other desires could be another form of rubrics. You could have some rubric havocs or power armored melee ones, maybe with some nice spears and shields could be fun. A Psycho Dreadnought or Hellbrute would be rather nice, or maybe some sort of Tzeentch demon engines, though I guess probably if that happens it might be those automata. I guess they are one of the factions that quite enjoy the redo of their Combat Patrol box set more than most, at least toning down the numbers of Zangors in there and getting some rubrics in the box. For the Death Guard, they're the Deity Legion that have got the most love and releases, just given that they were the focal army of 8th edition, so got a fairly developed range there with a whole bunch of infantry and demon engines and lots of characters. I'd guess that as a result, releases for them might be a little bit more on the limited side. Perhaps towards the top of the wish list might be either a proper Lord of Contagion, one that maybe looks a bit more like the Dark Imperium one, rather than the Lord Felthius model, which not everyone likes, or potentially having an actual Death Guard Lord on foot. That's still being an option within their index, but just having to go down using the generic Chaos Space Marine figure doesn't feel quite as cool for them. Otherwise, perhaps one of the other most easy ways that they could expand or redo things would maybe be, say, reboxing the Plague Marines to include the reinforcements in the 7-man set to make them a 10-man box set, and to make them a bit less weirdly expensive at least, even if coming in Nurgle's holy number does have a bit of fun factor. And again, like Thousand Sons, just to make the Plague Marines feel a bit more ubiquitous, I feel like some of the other battlefield roles could be really nice for them. Again, perhaps a heavy weapon or havoc style set could be rather good, or perhaps one with breacher shields, or maybe another option to bring back could be a specific Death Guard Possessed one. I guess maybe done in a similar sort of style to the World Eaters 8-bound perhaps. Possessed were a unit that they had access to and then went to Legends given that they weren't Death Guard specific ones. Again, like the Thousand Sons, I'm sure they might well welcome their Combat Patrol rebox. The current one's fine to fill out a big horde of supporting Poxwalkers and definitely isn't useless, but it doesn't really feel like the best starting point for the majority of players. For the World Eaters, I think most people are hoping that they have a good second release wave. The one that came out at the end of 9th edition did have some good stuff, but at the same time definitely felt on the smaller side of things for essentially adding a new faction to Warhammer 40k, even if it was kind of expansion of a sub-faction. The single most odds-on thing that they seem pretty likely to get are the Berserker Surgeons. They were mentioned in lore absolutely loads at the launch of the last Codex. They're the ones that create the 8-bound and maintain the Butcher's Nails, and seem to be absolutely integral to the Legion actually having some sort of form as a coherent fighting force, rather than just reverting to their tendency as absolute blood-crazed nutters. But just given the amount that they were mentioned, it feels like they could be a new generic character, perhaps joining some Khorne Berserkers. Maybe they'd do some sort of similar things to the Blood Angel Sanguinary Priest, giving them both damage buffs and durability buffs. Berserkers with a feel no pain or the ability to resurrect some models could be kind of fun. One other possible hope could be World Eater's Juggernaut Cavalry, with some mounted berserkers on brazen steeds. It did look like we got hints of them in the 9th Codex, with a bunch of shadowy mounted figures following Lord Invocatus into battle. And in theory, Lord Invocatus is supposed to be leading some riders into battle, and it'd be quite good to have a Juggernaut squad to go alongside him, as it just feels a bit more appropriate for a mounted model. I think they'd be fairly well welcomed if they did. It was also kind of notable that the last World Eaters Codex in 9th edition basically had nothing but Spawn as a fast attack choice, and usually Games Workshop did have a bit of an ethos of having at least some choice in each of the major battlefield roles. Otherwise, for other World Eaters' cornate wishes and desires, the absence of Red Butcher's Terminators was a bit of a talking point in the last Codex. I think people were just really strongly expecting them, given that the Thousand Sons and Death Guard got Terminator variants. As a result, I really can't help but imagine that World Eaters Terminator will happen sometime sooner or later in Warhammer 40k. It might be more of a question as to whether or not 8-bounds took their release slot for when the Codex initially came out. Otherwise, for options, maybe a standard Lord on foot would be quite a good one to have. It does feel a bit odd that the standard World Eater's Lord has to be mounted on a Juggernaut, and that means that you can't join Berserkers in Rhinos or anything like that, and that's left to Masters of Executions if you want something there, or Khan himself. I feel like a smaller demon engine of Khorne of one sort or another would be pretty awesome as well. They could take a bit of inspiration from the 412 Blood Slaughterer. I think something will be fun to fit in maybe the sort of lighter demon engine category like Venom Crawlers or Bloat Drones. And I guess they could do things like Rapture or Biker equivalents for some Berserkers keen to get to the front, though I'd put my guesses on Juggernaut Cavalry before we get those. One other thing that I've seen mentioned from time to time is they could give World Eaters access to the Slaughter Brute from Age of Sigmar in the same sort of way as the Thousand Sons got access to the Mutalith Vortex Beast. Feels like that's very much the Cornate equivalent of that, though maybe they're not trying to put too many Age of Sigmar ported kits into Warhammer 40k. I feel like there was very much a mixed reaction at best to the arrival of Zangors there, even if they are a fair bit more accepted now. Even with the huge focus on Thousand Sons recently with the Space Marine 2 game though, they certainly didn't rush to add Mutalith Vortex Beasts into that. Very much not really considered the sort of thing that's meant to be front and centre for, say, the Thousand Sons aesthetic. While we're on the subject of the deity codexes, that also brings us to Codex Chaos Demons. There's quite a strong suspicion that they might well get broken up into the deity legion codexes in a similar sort of way to how demons are treated in Age of Sigmar. This one's been basically rumoured since forever for Codex Chaos Demons, though I think we've got quite a lot more reason to suspect it in 10th edition than before, as well as just various rumours and theories and speculation online. The Grotmus detachments maybe feel like the single biggest hint that something isn't going to be the same with them. It was just very curious that the demons got basically 4 times as many Grotmus detachments as anyone else, 1 detachment for each one of the Chaos deities, when clearly if they were doing a Codex Chaos Demons for 10th edition, those same detachments would have been the absolute focal point for content in the Codex. On top of that, a few people noticed that the artwork in the detachments also pictured some Chaos Space Marines as well. And again, that definitely feels like another hint that they could be considered one and the same. If that does happen, I guess each of the Chaos books would kind of become the sort of Demonkin version of their armies. World Eaters could have their pick of the Khorne demons, and Death Guard could have their pick of Plague Bearers and Great Unclean Ones and things. That would certainly be a pretty radical shake-up for the armies if that did happen. For actual miniature releases for demons though, if they do wind up giving them something, then it could be one of the resin models that are retired. There's the Blue Scribes, Epidemius, the Transweaver, Herald on Juggernaut, and the Flux Master, all of which I believe were resin and are now being removed from sale. Any one of those could be a good choice to reinterpret into plastic. Otherwise, they do have the unit of Furies of Chaos that could come back. Maybe just re-releasing the Warcry ones for 40k could be nice enough. If they want to keep the Nurgle Herald the Spoilpox Scrivener around, it does feel a bit weird that he's locked to a Spearhead box set at the moment. And otherwise, if they were to redo things in a bigger way, it could perhaps be certain ones of the lesser demons that they could go for. I feel like the rank and file troops are some of the ones that are showing their age a bit more than a few of the other kits that have had a fair few updates and re-releases over the years. Next up, for the Space Dwarves, the Leagues of Votann are also strongly expecting a second wave of miniatures, and it certainly looks like something could be on its way for them. They do seem to have had a few hints and teasers in the rumour engines. I'd guess that any release wave for them won't be quite as big as the one that they had for 9th edition, but still hopefully expand the roster to a few more unit classes. The single most likely thing certainly feels like it's the Leagues of Votann jump infantry that we saw one of in their Hearthkin Salvager style kill team. I guess probably armed with plasma axe and pistol if they go by this guy. But otherwise, maybe one of the things that I think a lot of people would quite like to see would be a Walker for the Leagues of Votann. It just feels like it'd fit in really well with their aesthetic. They could do something sort of land speeder style, maybe like a big version of their trikes. There did seem to be a few bigger hover vehicles that appeared in their Codex art last time around that could maybe fit the bill for something like that. Definitely the possibility for more characters to go alongside. And for the rumour engines, we got a rather interesting toolbox for them, looking like it's being carried in one of their robot hands, and that one's kind of interesting, given that we already basically have a Votann engineer. Interesting to think where that might be for. For the Drukhari, they're perhaps one of the single factions in 40k that most needs an update. They've often generally tended to be a bit of a lesser played faction compared with a few of the rest, even if they do definitely have a following, and it feels like Games Workshop just hasn't been super generous with the kit releases as a result. But at the moment they do feel like they've got a slightly disturbing amount of their Codex units that aren't even on sale. The Grotesques, the Beastmaster, the Court of the Archon, and Urium Rakarth, all of those guys were fine cast and have been removed from the web store. Though admittedly, in particular for the Grotesques and the Beastmaster, the fancast models that they did have before that just weren't really fit for purpose in the first place. Not really amazing quality due to being made in their slightly dodgy resin, but also just ludicrously expensive and pretty monopose if you did want to build entire units of them. Those ones feel like they should be the absolute top priority just to stop the Drukhari range from diminishing or having new players asking where they can even buy certain units for the army. They'll feel like beyond that, maybe the single most interesting one they could release might be the return of Astra Militarum to the tabletop, likely on his souped up Days of Destruction raider, and I feel like that'd be a really cool one to see in 40k. He is one of the rather big bads of the setting that they haven't realised in miniature form yet. Otherwise though, if they did want to make a bunch of other character releases, there's plenty to dig into. They could do Lady Malice, Duke Slisus, or Karajurak. There's definitely more than enough here to have a very solid release wave for the Drukhari if Games Workshop decided to. Whatever happens though, I can't help but think that the 10th edition Combat Patrol update is going to be bad news for them, given that their one's particularly nice at the moment with both a Raider and a Ravager in there. Next up we've got the Grey Knights, and they're just clearly a faction that's very much waiting for their primary scale update. Maybe more notable for the Strike Marines before, but now we've had 10th edition and upscale Terminators. I guess at some point some of the regular Brotherhood Terminators or Paladins might be updated to match. Games Workshop certainly have implied that they're going to be upscaling the Grey Knights by Castellan Crow, who's a bit bigger than the rest of the miniatures in power armour, and as a result it feels more of a question of when they get round to it rather than if. Will they have a big range refresh in 10th edition, or will it be saved till 11th edition or later? I'd guess that they'd probably do it in a big swoop in and go for one and done in a similar way to the Black Templars, given that the vast majority of their unique units are just based around 3 main kits at the moment. I feel like it wouldn't be the biggest stretch in the world for Games Workshop just to swoop in and replace them whole scale at some stage, so it's maybe more of a question as to whether they get that in 10th edition or not. Otherwise though, if they did decide to just give them token character releases, maybe Caldor Drago or Brother Captain Stern seem like particularly good options. Both much older miniatures and fairly well developed characters. I'm sure they'd look rather nice redone in style. I think if they did keep them a bit more low-key for 10th edition, I'd be a bit more suspicious of maybe Captain Stern or perhaps a more generic HQ getting a do-over than Drago. They feel like they're perhaps a little bit more likely to save faction leaders for being redone alongside a range refresh. Maybe in a similar boat, but feeling kind of odds-on to get some updates, are the Space Wolves. Again, a firstborn army of Space Marines that it seems inevitable that Games Workshop are going to get around to updating a whole bunch of their miniatures into Primaris form. And it's more of a question of when than if. Space Wolves do feel kind of odds-on to get an update in 10th edition though. It feels like this is the edition for updating the Divergent chapters. We've already had a release wave for Dark Angels and then Blood Angels, and even Black Templars got an update in the previous edition. And it's kind of conspicuous that Space Wolves didn't come out alongside any of the other updates, so it feels like they're going to be left till later and have a good chance of getting an update themselves. If Games Workshop are going to keep the Primarchs running, and the release of Fulgrim does seem to imply that they are, then Leman Russ would be the next most likely one to come back in my book, given that he's just the most obvious choice for having an entire army range that is already there to support him. For the other major Divergent Codex Space Marine chapters, I guess the Black Templars will be Dawn, but if he came back he'd be clearly an Imperial Fist release and not primarily aimed at them. Sanguinius being slain is kind of central to the entire Blood Angels lore and backstory. We've just had Lionel Johnson, so the only other major Space Marine sub-faction that's got a whole ton of model support are the Space Wolves, and Leman Russ was always a Primarch that would be particularly easy to handwave his return lore-wise, as he just basically went off on a mission with his most trusted battle brothers and never came back. So even more so than most of them, there's no death that they need to retcon or anything. If they try and do a rinse and repeat for 9th edition, I feel like there'd be a very good chance he could come back in a sort of end of edition campaign. That definitely feels plausible. Otherwise though, if they did do a more wide Space Wolf update this time around, Logan Grimnar also sticks out as a really obvious choice. He hasn't got a new miniature when Dante and Azrael both did. and Games Workshop randomly showcased new artwork of him, which they often do ahead of a miniature release, as they've done with the Dark Angels, Asmodai, and plenty of others before. Otherwise though, beyond that, there's all manner of different releases that they could do for the Space Wolves. It's more picking and choosing which ones they want to. Some manner of Wolfguard or Wolfguard Terminators seem like they'll be on the list. An updated Bjorn the Fell-Handed could be really cool, and he has been making notable appearances in social media a few times. Games Workshop both reminding that he's existed like 2 times in the last year, and also specifically trying to plug Space Wolf kits as well, which felt like a stock clearance. I guess they might do some more rank and file Space Wolves like Blood Claws or Grey Hunters potentially, though given what the Blood Angels got, I feel like there'd be a bit of a danger that they could just be an upgrade sprue for Intercessors or Assault Intercessors, and otherwise I kind of wonder whether or not they'd have Thunderwolves and Wolfen redone. They feel like a little bit other and might be a little bit less likely to get redone with the first wave of Space Wolf releases. I guess we'd wait and see on that front though. Finally, for 10th edition Codex releases though, we've got the Black Templars. I feel like, compared with most factions out there, it's a bit less obvious what exactly they'd do for them, or what would be the next steps for a Black Templar release if they did release something for them each edition from now. The Templars just had a very complete range refresh in 9th edition, all their best known named characters and multiple generic ones released, plus their best known infantry variants in the Crusader Squad and the Sword Brethren. I'd guess as a result they'd be most likely to get something small, maybe a single character miniature, judging by what Games Workshop's often done in the past. I guess given that they're unusually well known for their chaplains, they could have a generic Templar chaplain to go alongside Grimaldus, though I feel like the tropes wouldn't be so enormously different from the more standard ones in Codex Space Marines. Maybe something like a cool banner bearer could be fun, or I guess they could always dream up another named character if desired. Or a recent community post asked for a few ideas for Templar collectors, and in terms of fan desires, the things that got the most love were a Templar-specific Dreadnought, maybe even a Chaplain-specific one, given that that was something that existed in the not-too-distant past, or perhaps going for a unique pattern of Terminators. Sword Brethren Terminator squads I'm sure would look pretty epic. I think there's been at least a few Black Templar players reinterpreting those Deathwing Knights of the Dark Angels for their purposes. I feel like it will be a fair bit more exciting to get a Dreadnought or Sword Brethren Terminators or similar, though I would be very surprised if they get anything more than a character for this one, to be honest. In any case though, I look forward to hearing your thoughts, hopes and opinions for what the remaining codexes of 10th edition should get. What do you think would be the best choices for them, and what do you think they're most likely to receive in practice? Finally though, before we go, I'll just cycle back to the video sponsor in Titan's Terrain for those interested, and talk a little bit more about their specific options for their pop-up tabletop terrain. As mentioned, they do have some pros and cons. Due to the fact that you fold out the tiles and buildings pop up, it's really easy to store and transport due to the folding system. It's far cheaper than Games Workshop terrain, and at least somewhat comparable to MDF. It doesn't need painting or assembly, the bits all being ready to go immediately. Every terrain set does have its pros and cons though. It is a little bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF, given that it's made of cardboard and needs to be able to fold flat. The grid system can lead to a bit less flexibility than some, even if you can get a bit by rotating terrain bits or maybe just using like 1 or 2 extra pieces to break up firing lanes. And obviously it doesn't make tournament approved layouts if that's what you're going for. For their options though, they do have a fair few different sets. They've got a fun Forgotten Furnace one, which is basically an all very chaos foundry with a bunch of glowing runes and factories and smelting pits and things. There's then a Shattered Hive one, a more traditional bombed out city, lots of ruins and armoured containers and things like that. And then they've got an Overgrown Capital one. This one may be a bit more designed to also be applicable to more fantasy style settings as well, maybe a little bit less obviously futuristic if you wanted to use it for both. Finally, each one of those also has a centerpiece set as well that you can get as an expansion. This one makes a larger building structure from 2 tiles being pushed together, and you get either a cathedral square or a ruined reliquary done in different colours, or a great big infernal spire for the foundry one. In any case, as always, a big thank you to them for sponsoring the video. I'll leave a link to them down in the video description. In any case though, that's just about it from me this time around. Feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. I certainly tend to keep the 40k videos coming all the time, with new ones out just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel and you'd like to help support, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help keep these coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.